Welcome to meeting number 31 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to Standing Order 108, subsection 2, and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 12, 2026, the committee is meeting on the review of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, pursuant to the standing orders. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. For the first panel, as an individual, Kai Ostwald, Associate Professor, Institute of Asian Research, University of British Columbia, and Dr. Ari van Asch, Full Professor, Department of International Business, HEC Montreal, by video conference. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. I now invite Mr. Kai Ostwald to make an opening statement.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair, for the invitation.
Today, I want to open with 3 observations and draw out a few implications for the review and the update of the Indo-Pacific strategy. To begin, the Indo-Pacific strategy as written, I think, gets a number of things correctly as basic statements of fact. Right? The Indo-Pacific region, Asia, is already the global epicenter of economic dynamism by many measures. If the trends continue as they are, that will only increase in the generation to come. It's also the geopolitical center of geopolitical challenge globally, whether that's because of rising power or rising powers, or of course specific security flashpoints. All of these things affect Canadian interests deeply. So I think the call to prioritize attention and resources to position Canada to meet these challenges in the generation ahead is correct. Right? I would add that the U.S. disruptions have accelerated the rationale for many of the elements that the Indo-Pacific strategy calls for. The Indo-Pacific strategy, since its launch, I think has produced a number of positive outcomes. Canada's presence in the region has increased in a number of ways, whether it's in the form of high-level visits from PM or ministerial level. Trade delegations have gotten traction and increased awareness of opportunities in engaging Canada in the region. People-to-people ties have clearly increased as well. Right? In terms of trade architecture, there are a number of advancements. The Canada-Indonesia agreement is one of them. Progress on the Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, discussions with the Philippines and Thailand. All of these are, I think, important steps forward that should be recognized. On the security front, there is more cooperation. There is greater presence of Canadians in the region, whether it's in the form of cyber collaboration or naval presence. There are also a number of game changers. The collaboration with the Philippines on dark vessel detection has really increased Canada's presence in the region and goodwill towards Canada. And I would say, if there is a silver lining of some of the disruptions from Trump, it's that there is more interest in engaging Canada now than I have in my career ever experienced before. And that takes many dimensions. So I think this is a unique opportunity and a unique moment as well. But I think those positives have to be positioned against a realistic assessment of Canada's baseline. From my perspective, Canada has underinvested in Asia and the Indo-Pacific for a number of decades. It was a late mover in articulating a strategy towards Asia relative to a lot of counterparts. And I think that's left Canada with 3 major deficits vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific. The first is in capacity and knowledge. The Indo-Pacific is a highly complex region, as we're all aware. I don't think there is sufficient familiarity, knowledge, expertise, language capacity in key sectors in Canada, whether that's the private sector, large parts of the public sector, to effectively leverage Canadian opportunities. And just to provide an anecdote, arguably UBC, where I'm a faculty member, is the most Asia-facing university in Canada. UBC has not offered a Southeast Asian language as a foreign language in over a decade. Right? Secondly, I think Canada has some deficits in its network. Getting things done across the Indo-Pacific requires personal connections and trust. The period of underinvestment has left Canadian networks thinner on the ground across Asia than those of many counterparts. That requires sustained engagement to overcome. And I would say that there is, to some extent, a reputational deficit to address as well in Canada on the part of, in Asia on the part of Canada, in that Canada has been seen as a fair weather friend to some extent in appearing in the region, engaging the region, but when political dynamics in Canada shift, retreating to some extent. Those have major implications for the Indo-Pacific and an update to it. First and foremost, from my perspective, Canada is by population a relatively small country with a giant neighbor to the south that will always occupy a good portion of our bandwidth. The pressure to increase defense spending will mean that there's more competition for finite resources. In short, I think if Canada is to meet the generational challenge that a rising Indo-Pacific and rising Asia presents, the region has to be a true priority in terms of the share of attention it receives and the share of resources it receives in order to risk not falling behind further. Secondly, I think expectations need to be calibrated correctly. Of course, we should expect real progress over the course of 1 or 2 or 3 years, but this is a generational challenge, and we'll see progress more in blocks of 5 or 10 years than we will in blocks of 1 or 2 years. Second, from the 5 pillars that the original Indo-Pacific strategy articulates, I think it's quite clear that trade and security have become the most important of those of the pillars. That may be warranted, but I think effectively delivering on both of those pillars requires, again, adequate human capacity and strong networks. And those are not possible to build without investments in human and people-to-people connections, diplomatic presence, and a range of other factors beyond purely security and trade.
Thank you. I would have to stop you. We're way over the time. Thank you for your statement. I now invite Dr. Arie van Asch to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Cher Monsieur le Président, chers membres du comité.
Chair, committee members, thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to your review of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I'll give my opening remarks in English, but afterwards it will be a pleasure to answer in either English or French.
This afternoon is straightforward. The global geopolitical context has evolved significantly since the strategy's launch in 2022. Today, the resilience of Canada's economy more than ever depends on its ability to reduce over-reliance on major economic powers, especially China and the United States, through deliberate and strategic trade diversification. The Indo-Pacific strategy can be a powerful vehicle to help achieve this objective, but it must be deployed more deliberately and more assertively as an instrument of economic statecraft. Let me be clear. This is not to diminish the strategy's early achievements. Over the past 4 years, Canada has meaningfully strengthened its trade and investment presence in the world's most dynamic economic region through an expanded diplomatic footprint, new trade agreements, and deeper political engagement. However, notwithstanding these gains, the strategy would benefit from a sharper and more disciplined articulation of the national interest outcomes it seeks to achieve, one that is more tightly aligned with Canada's trade diversification strategy and broader economic security priorities. In my view, advancing this perspective requires 3 fundamental shifts in thinking. First, we need to go from export expansion to value chain positioning. Rather than treating export growth to the Indo-Pacific as an end in itself, the strategy should focus on securing more resilient and strategically anchored positions within global value chains. The objective is not simply to export more, but to reduce Canada's critical dependencies, both on the import side and on the export side. This shift requires asking more targeted questions. Which trade dependencies expose Canada to the greatest economic security risks, and how can a more focused Indo-Pacific engagement help build resilient value chain positions? Shift number 2, which is from broad-based engagement to sector-selective focus. Rather than engaging equally across all industries, the strategy should prioritize sectors that are central to Canada's economic security. Not all sectors carry the same economic security risks. Industries such as defense, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors are far more exposed to disruption and coercion than non-strategic sectors like Christmas lights, and therefore require more coordinated state intervention. This implies a more selective industrial policy posture in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and this raises also two questions, one being which sectors should Canada designate as strategic, and second, how can Indo-Pacific engagement be leveraged to reinforce domestic capabilities and international collaboration in these sectors? Shift number 3, from diffuse regional engagement to targeted strategic partnerships. Rather than treating the Indo-Pacific as a single, uniform region, the strategy should focus on building deeper partnerships with a limited number of countries that are most aligned with Canada's economic security objectives. Not all partners offer the same level of reliability or strategic complementarity. Countries such as Japan, South Korea, India, and key ASEAN members each bring distinct strengths in areas like critical minerals, advanced manufacturing, and clean technologies. These partnerships should therefore be tailored, sector-specific, and strategically prioritized. And this again leads to two questions. Which partners are best positioned to support Canada's objectives in strategic sectors? And how can we deepen these relationships to build trusted and resilient economic ties? So let me briefly conclude with implementation. To operationalize these shifts, I've in recent work proposed a simple 5P framework. And the 5 Ps are, first, pursue trade expansion in non-strategic sectors. 2, protect against choke points in strategic sectors. 3, promote domestic strong points in sectors that are strategic for other countries. 4, partner with trusted Indo-Pacific allies to build shared economic security. And 5, pinpoint emerging risks through strong economic intelligence. So to conclude, revisiting Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy requires a more security-driven approach, a whole-of-government strategy that aligns trade diversification toward the Indo-Pacific region with economic security and industrial policy goals. Merci, et il me fait un plaisir de répondre à vos.
Thank you. I'll be glad to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your statement.
Questions beginning with MP Ziad Abou Taif. You have 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses, Mr. Oswald and Dr. Van Asch. You both highlight on some very important key elements of this study and what we need to do. Mr. Oswald, you list the deficits that we have. One of them capacity and knowledge, then network, then reputational. I'm one of the members of Parliament that are aware of our deficits in trade in general, not just with the Indo-Pacific, but in general, that due to my life experience before politics. And then if I understood correctly, and here's the question to both of you, just to make sure that I have understood correctly, we need to focus. We need to focus in the market that we're going to. It doesn't have to be just China as the largest economy there. And we need to choose which product we can push into this market, because we are way behind in getting into these markets, and we need to start somewhere at least to give ourselves a breathing space until we become ready. And then we have to look internally to see how can be ready as a market to make sure that we've got the product needed to be thrown in the chosen markets. And in order to do that, how do you assess the situation in Canada as far as our readiness? Which sectors we need to push? For example, do we need to focus on oil and gas, on energy sectors, which is something that we have and that is on high demand? And how can we do that in a time where we know that other markets are way ahead of us, we know that the competition is ahead of us, and then we know that we're not ready. We made ourselves unready to be basically able to supply these markets?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Professor Van Asch and I seem aligned that it is important for Canada to be strategic in directing its resources and attention. That means focusing on specific sectors and specific opportunities. I would add, on top of pursuing exports, there's a lot of demand for Canadian expertise in the region as well, and that should be an important part of the conversation.
Dr. Van Asch?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your question. So, Canadian firms are generally ready to internationalize, and they've been doing this very successfully for many years. Of course, there still are a lot of hurdles that they are facing in all kinds of sectors, either strategic or non-strategic, and Canada for many decades already has been helping Canadian firms going abroad. I think that right now, as we are looking at some of the bigger concerns and problems that we're facing, one of the issues is that in many sectors, or in some sectors at least, we are overly dependent on specific countries. And as a result of that, there is a need for us to reflect on what we can do to make sure that our companies can also get stronger in other sectors. In non-strategic sectors, I think that the most important thing to do is continue reflecting on which countries we can develop trade agreements with, in reflecting on how we can use our diplomatic corps to help our companies internationalize in these countries, but ultimately by simply supporting market mechanisms. Then there are other sectors that are strategic sectors, and there maybe there is more of a need for us to reflect on industrial policies that is going to help us reduce overly strong dependencies on specific countries that could weaponize or conduct coercive actions against Canada. So that would be my answer to your question.
In the situation we're in, the first thing you'd think of, what's the low-hanging fruits that we need to focus on, at least to start going? Will you be able both to start listing just the 3 low-hanging fruits product that we can lead with in those markets?
I'm not an expert on trade, so I won't presume to have the answer offhand. I think one of the major challenges is that the awareness in Canada's private sector of opportunities in the Indo-Pacific is limited. So there hasn't been sufficient contact, and the trade missions are geared towards addressing this. The Canada-ASEAN Business Council, other business councils have done a lot of important work here, but there is a lot more work to do to align the supply on the Canadian side with the demand on the Asian side to identify exactly where the low-hanging fruit is. But I defer to my colleague on specifics.
Thanks. So low-hanging fruit is always a tricky question. I think that if we're looking at what is going on right now, we know that there is a desire to, in the defense industry, for example, perhaps make sure that we are less reliant on specific countries to obtain our military products. That is kind of a good area where we could, on both the export side and on the import side, say, well, can we actually, through collaboration with certain Asian countries, make sure that we are having a more diversified sourcing or export of defense products. That's kind of one example. Another example is actually clean energy technologies. If you look at electrical vehicle batteries or solar panels, there is one specific country that is the biggest source of these products is China. And for our clean energy transition, it's not bad getting cheap products coming from China, but being overly reliant on this one country can at certain moments lead to certain danger of coercive actions. So that's another area where we can say, well, maybe we should be diversifying a bit. And then the final thing I'll say is, I mean, and this is more on the export side, is critical minerals. I mean, so we have this incredible wealth in critical minerals here in Canada. This is something that the U.S. is looking for, but a lot of other Asian countries, Japan, Korea, also are looking at sourcing critical minerals. That actually gives us a bit of leverage to be able to find ways how we can diversify our trade, but also ensure that our strong points in trade can help in our negotiations.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Stephen Guilbeault. You have 6 minutes.
Merci, merci beaucoup, messieurs.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today. The committee appreciates your participation and your testimony. Perhaps a question or two about the issue of trade and another one that's a bit broader. Of course, what we're hearing a lot from small and medium businesses is that it's very easy to engage in trade with the United States. It's the same language and there's geographic proximity. Export costs or import costs, depending on the case, are limited compared to greater distances, of course. So what advice would you have, Professor Ostwald, you talked about certain associations that do the necessary work for knowledge and contacts, but what would be your recommendations for the government? What other actions could we take to lessen those obstacles?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
That awareness is really key here. Right? The more awareness there is of opportunities, the more contact there is of opportunity, the more contact there is between Canadian firms and those and markets in Asia, the more evident it becomes where the opportunities really are. The obstacle of the world's biggest market, just south of the border, that speaks similar language, same languages, and is culturally very familiar. Of course, that's difficult to overcome, and it's difficult to convince the private sector to put in the work to identify opportunities abroad. I would say consistently, the story of economic development and growth in Asia is largely a result of the region being very committed to development and being, on the whole, quite business friendly. So I think once that work has been done, the opportunities are evident, and there are a number of success stories of Canadian companies, both large and smaller, that have very effectively expanded into the Indo-Pacific. The framework for doing this, the groundwork has been done by the trade commissions, for example. The trade missions are important. The business councils are all standing by and ready to work. I think it is fundamentally a matter of awareness as well, though, and that messaging needs to be made more clearly. That there are a lot of opportunities for Canada's private sector in Asia, and there are a lot of resources available at this point already to support that transition.
Monsieur Van Asch, voulez-vous ajouter quelque chose?
Professor Van Asch, would you like to add something? Yes, absolutely. Thank you for your question. Mr. Guilbeault, I agree with the comment from my colleague. Indeed, it's a lot easier to do trade for SMEs in the United States than in Asia, which means that there are greater costs to businesses dealing with Asia, but in particular, there are a lot of opportunities in Asia, and it's the region of the world that is most dynamic, economically speaking, which means their opportunities are also greater. So, indeed, the important things are, first of all, to help our businesses to get an understanding of where the opportunities lie. Secondly, to reduce costs for our businesses in reaching out to Asia, and indeed having trade commissioners, which is very important. And once our businesses begin doing more business there, they begin to become part of a network. And once you enter into networks, of business networks, then all of a sudden costs for operating down there can be reduced. So we need to begin participating in doing more there and including our activities more in that region. And gradually we could perhaps ensure that we are in a position to reduce operational costs doing business there and increase the opportunities. Thank you. Perhaps two more questions, one after the other. We talked about critical minerals and increasing demand for those minerals in a number of countries that indeed want to diversify their sources of supply, for example, rather than China. But isn't there a risk to us if we only export natural resources and if we keep on having resource-based economy rather than on the value added that we could achieve using those products? And how can we interest those economic partners? We talked about South Korea, we talked about Japan and India. How could we get them to invest here to have value added in development of critical minerals? I'm sorry for the long question. And the other question, perhaps for you, Professor Van Esch, because I know you work specifically on China and on sustainability issues. Some have criticized what we call a rapprochement of Canada to China. What about nature, biodiversity, and climate? Isn't there a need for a country such as ours, or any country interested in those issues, to work with the giant that China is on those issues, as we do, for example, in COP15 in 2022? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We go next to Monsieur.
They don't have time to respond?
No.
Oh,
because
I'm sorry.
Sorry, because there was a long comment, and then maybe they can respond after in the next round. We go next to MP Duceppe. You have 6 minutes.
C'est dommage.
It's unfortunate, Chair, because those were excellent questions from my colleague. However, I'm going to ask the same question, but slightly differently, Professor Van Esch, relating the fact that there is an issue of being able to get closer to China on issues such as the environment. But you also referred in your initial remarks, or perhaps in response to a question by my colleague, about industry having new energies, for example, solar panels in China. But I didn't hear anyone since the beginning of the meeting talk to us about forced labor allegations, particularly for the production of the solar panels. So it's one thing to say that we need to get closer to China on certain environmental issues, but if the products that are perhaps good for the planet ultimately have in the supply chain some forced labor, wouldn't that be a reason perhaps to avoid getting closer to China?
C'est à moi, je peux répondre.
I'm sorry, thank you, Mr. Duceppe. I'll try to answer it. So indeed, there are a lot of issues in dealing with China. First of all, as Mr. Guilbeault mentioned, doing business with China could give rise to opportunities. And of course, if we're able to import products, energy products, at a lower cost, that's fine for consumers and it's fine for the clean energy transition as well. But we have to be cautious if we're too dependent, if it's a country that has economic security risks. And of course, naturally, we have to always be careful about the fact that potentially in products imported from China or elsewhere, that in the supply chain, there could be forced labor. So I think we ought not to be naive in our relations with China. We have to be cautious, and we already have aspects in place that when our businesses do business with China, that they avoid importing products with forced labor. And we also have to be careful that we're not in the process of creating more economic security risks as well. On the other hand, you talked about legislation on forced labor. If you refer to that, perhaps you're familiar with current laws in Canada on that. Thus far, if I'm not mistaken, only one boat has been arrested for reasons of forced labor so far, or the products of forced labor, and this ship was sent back, and it was able to sell its products in Canada. So thus far, the Canadian legislation against forced labor has not led to any actual search of any or seizure of products compared to what happens in the States. Shouldn't that be the priority? First off, the respect of international human rights in international trade, and in your remarks you talked about turning to trusted allies. Do you sincerely believe that China is an ally to be trusted in the areas of human rights and that Canada should continue in that direction? Or shouldn't we instead change the Canadian legislation and copy the Americans and have actual results against forced labor? Answer, yes, very good questions. Of course, when I talked about China as a potential ally, I was talking about economic security issues, or in fact, one has to, in many sectors, there are issues. It's not a bad thing to continue trade with China in certain sectors where China is quite dominant, and it could be, if it could be coercive, then we have to be cautious about it. And the legislation that Canada brought in to avoid imports of products with forced labor, it's a first step based mostly on recording and due diligence. In Europe, we see that they're going in that direction, and I think that Canada ought to continue working with Europe and other countries to make sure that we jointly have a greater understanding of how to implement due diligence on those issues, and at the same time, not all products that are imported from China are likely to have forced labor. So one has to be pragmatic in the way we do it. Yes, but the issue, and I'll get back to you, Professor Ostwald, but it's a good discussion, but the deal we had with the Chinese government on electric vehicles, we know that forced labor in China, it's not the private companies that are responsible for the forced labor, it's actually the government. So if you look at an excellent study from Sheffield University, it demonstrates that Chinese electric cars, even at $35,000, even with shipping from China to Canada, that there is forced labor involved. So as Quebecers and Canadians, would we prefer a $35,000 electric car because it's good for the environment and for our wallets? Or, but people are working in concentration camps in Xinjiang in forced labor. I understand it's a difficult question to decide. Not for me, but a number of people seem to have a hard time deciding, and I'd like to hear from you on that.
Unfortunately, because we're over time, and
Non, donc je pense que.
So I think that Canada should work with other countries to make sure that we have the best legislation to ensure that we avoid having forced labor in the production chain, and also it's important to continue to have a commitment with China in a balanced way without saying that we're going to, import things with forced labor into the country.
round of questioning, beginning with Madame Rood. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. Mr. Ostwald, you've called for rethinking like-mindedness in the strategy and stressed ASEAN's preference for inclusive dialogue with China. Given Beijing's aggression in the South China Sea and toward Taiwan, in your opinion, has this approach left Canada weak, deferring to a body that refuses to confront coercion while our like-minded allies such as Japan, Australia, or the U.S. actually deliver results?
Thank you for the question. I made the call for rethinking like-mindedness in a particular sense. I think it's important for Canada to think of its interests and countries that share particular interests in a broad sense, and that means looking for other countries that value sovereignty, that value agency, that value a predictable international framework and order, especially with trade. And I think there are a number of partners in Southeast Asia that that are not fully autocratic, but also not fully democratic, that that share those values, and I see a lot of opportunity in connecting with those countries on those particular fronts. On the China question, I take also cues from Southeast Asia, who has a long history and a lot of experience in dealing with what is their regional giant. I think what you'll find consistently in a number of academic studies, for example, that assess elite preferences and elite perspectives in Southeast Asia on China is a recognition that China is a strategically vital country and that it deeply affects the interests of those countries, but also that China has a substantial trust deficit vis-a-vis many other countries. There is very little trust that China will do the right thing on a number of fronts. And of course, that's caused friction with virtually every country in Southeast Asia. The Philippines is the most obvious example with the South China Sea, but all other countries in the region have their versions of this. I think where we differ is in the response. The Philippines has been very vocal and very public about its disagreements with China. Other countries have handled those disagreements in quieter ways without using a megaphone. I'm not sure it's so simple as one country has gotten it right and another country has gotten it wrong. I think all countries are figuring out how to work with and respond to a rising China.
Dr. Van Ash, Canadian supply chains remain dangerously exposed to China in critical areas like semiconductors, rare earths, and pharmaceuticals. What concrete failures in the current Liberal strategy have prevented real de-risking and friend-shoring with trusted partners like the U.S. and Japan and India?
So I think that the main issue has been that any kind of market economy can lead to specialization that sometimes can go a little bit too far. And so when we had a bit more stable liberal international order where most countries at most times were hesitant to take advantage of their dominance in a certain sector to pressure other countries geopolitically, this is no longer the case right now. So we're seeing this from our southern neighbor. We're seeing this from China at occasions as well. And so ultimately, a reality that we thought was very comfortable before, now actually where at occasions you might find out that one country is responsible for 80% of electrical vehicle battery assembly, now suddenly actually ends up being a bit more dangerous and a bit less comfortable. And so this is a bit the reality that we have right now, that we cannot fall back on the regular systems to prevent countries from doing this.
In an era of geopolitical choke points and strategic interdependence, does the current approach adequately protect Canada from Beijing's weaponization of trade, or do we need far tougher investment screening, export controls, and sectoral decoupling from the CCP?
So that's a great question. So I think, first of all, what we need to do is we actually have to identify in which strategic sectors there are choke points. In reality, there are not thousands of choke points in the global trading system right now. It's much more limited, but we don't really always know what they are, so we have to identify them. And then once we identify them, we can actually take actions to de-risk from them. But right now, we're often acting very reactively. We see that in maybe semiconductors or in pharmaceuticals, there is a choke point, and then we try to, after de-risk against it, we can do more to actually identify them in advance.
Thank you very much. Next, we go to MP Oliphant. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses for being here today. I have three questions I'm going to be asking. The first one is on the degree to which you might believe or not believe that Canada's IPS has penetrated the consciousness of the areas you're interested in. The second would be moving away, and it's been in the line of the theme we've been on today, is away from China and India into ASEAN, other markets, into the larger players in the Southeast, including Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Philippines as the bigger economies. A little bit about that. And the third one will be the role of government versus the entrepreneurial spirit of businesses and how we work together, because government can set the table, but businesses have to eat. So the first question is with respect to the degree to which you think the IPS has penetrated the consciousness of anyone that is our object of affection. Maybe Professor Oswald first.
Sure. I'll say, as I alluded to in the opening statement, I think Canada is a more present and active partner in the Indo-Pacific now than it was 5 years ago, and certainly more than it was 10 years ago. To the extent that the Indo-Pacific, the IPS, which I see as one component of a recognition, Canadian recognition of the importance of this region is responsible for it, then it has. But I will say again, I have not witnessed in the course of my career as much interest in having Canada at the table and having Canada as an engaged country in the Indo-Pacific as has been the case over the last year.
Professor Van Asch, any comment on that?
Yes. So we're certainly more active in the Indo-Pacific region, and that's a really good thing. But we're not the only country that is more active in the Indo-Pacific region. And so as a result of that, we might be fighting harder against other hard-fighting countries. And so we have to be cognizant of that. Nonetheless, being present is really good.
Area, which we've already been getting into, is this is the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's not the China strategy. It's not the India strategy. It's Indo-Pacific. At times, it feels we focus a lot on China and India. I want to pull us down to the southeast and what you would perceive our best opportunities are, both geopolitically and economically. So perhaps first again with Professor Ostwald.
Thank you. I think the focus on Southeast Asia is vital. It obviously, as a region, often gets overshadowed by India and China. Southeast Asia, we should be reminded, is a region of 700 million people. It's not trivial. And I think it has the major advantage in some respects. The politics may be contentious, but they're not confrontational in a way that we see with China and India over the last number of years. Canada has a long legacy in Southeast Asia. It's recognized as a middle power that shares many of the same geopolitical realities that countries in Southeast Asia do. The middle class is growing rapidly as an economic partner. It's vital, but also I think it's an area where a lot of Canadian expertise in navigating the type of geopolitical challenges and geoeconomic challenges that middle powers face is valued. Right. So,
you like asking a parent to pick their favorite child. However, are there countries in your work that you would think would be the easiest for Canada to be targeting at this time?
I think that needs to be broken down by sector. In terms of trade, obviously the larger economies, the larger markets, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, all matter. Thailand is a large economy as well. In terms of a lot of Canadian expertise in tech, Singapore is a key partner. On AI, Malaysia is emerging as one of the chief hosts of farms. And also, it should be noted, the second leading producer of chips behind Taiwan on a number of key technologies. On naval issues and maritime issues, obviously the Philippines has been a very valuable partner on the DVD. So I think it really depends on the issue area we're talking about.
Just want to go to Professor Van Asch for a moment and just ask if there's any comments you have on what encouragements or enticements we get to diversify our trade at the business level. Big companies like bigger countries, maybe small countries do well in small companies in small countries. Any advice you have for us on that?
A 10-second response, please.
Well, I'll say that we need to really kind of think about strategic and non-strategic sectors very differently. Non-strategic sectors, that is kind of where business should be able to do as usual, and we should be helping them. In strategic sectors, there maybe industrial policy will be a bit more important.
Thank you very much. We go next to Monsieur Duceppe, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. So you said we talk too much about China when we're doing our Indo-Pacific strategy. It's like criticizing the Liberals for talking too much about the United States when we're talking about the CUSMA, which in fact includes Mexico. So I think it's only logical. And indeed, Professor Ostwald, you talked about semiconductors. If tomorrow morning Taiwan were to, let's say, fall prey to China through a military action, because such a possibility has been discussed for a long time, what would be the results of such an offensive by China on Taiwan for production of semiconductors if that production were to fall into the hands of the Beijing regime? Is this something which would be a worldwide catastrophe, in fact?
Thank you for the question. This is not an area of my expertise, but I think we can all agree that an invasion of Taiwan would be catastrophic on many fronts. Taiwan is integral to global supply chains on not just with chips, but on many other fronts as well. And not just because of the direct effect, but the second-order effects of an invasion like that would deeply shake supply chains and confidence in the security of supply chains across the Indo-Pacific.
Et donc,
Accordingly, wouldn't that be an additional reason to consolidate our ties with Taiwan to make sure that Taiwan will not suffer such a military offensive, and also to reassure our Taiwanese friends, and they are quite an important middle power, the 16th largest GDP in the world, Taiwan. Wouldn't that be the main reason why we ought to have even more solid ties with Taiwan and reassure them in terms of security?
I would say there are many arguments for building stronger ties with Taiwan. They go from tech over to security. Of course, if I'm just speaking anecdotally about my experiences at the university, interests in Taiwan are very high amongst the younger generation. I don't know whether Canada has the ability to provide meaningful deterrence for Taiwan, but providing the support it can, both through economic exchange and strengthening of economic ties, sharing of expertise, I think that's very
donc de
sensible.
signer l'accord qui a été
So signing the agreement that was approved a year ago with Taiwan would be a strong message to send, because it's a possibility for Canada indeed to have solid economic ties with Taiwan, and it would send a message to Beijing that Canada right now is.
Again, I think there are a lot of arguments to make for strengthening ties with Taiwan.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Michael Chong. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, the government released the Indo-Pacific strategy in November of 2022. Do both of you as witnesses agree that it's a good idea to have a written foreign policy on the Indo-Pacific region in a single document?
I would certainly say there are a lot of advantages to that. I think it does a number of things. It signals.
So you agree it's a good idea?
I think it signals that Canada does prioritize the Indo-Pacific, and I think it also.
Okay. So here's the question I'm asking. We've been told by the government in testimony this past week that they're not going to update the document. That there's been changes to the Indo-Pacific strategy as it was originally published in November of 2022. Those changes include the Prime Minister announcing in Asia last year that Canada wants to expedite the Canadian oil and gas to the region and wants to turn Canada into an energy superpower and wants to export far more quantities of oil and gas to the region. I think the Prime Minister made reference to doubling Canada's natural gas exports from about 50 million tons a year that's expected by 2030 to 100 million tons by 2040. So when I asked the minister about updating the strategy to reflect this, because the word oil and gas does not appear in that strategy, she indicated that she had directed officials to update the strategy, which I took to mean to update the document. Now we find out that the document's not going to be updated in a singular fashion, and maybe updated through a speech the minister gives or in other ways. So we're now back to a situation where as prior to the Indo-Pacific strategy being published, we're not clear on what exactly the government's policy is in the region. And I'm trying to get your views on whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing.
I can't speak to the government's decisions on whether to.
It's a good idea to have a single published document that contains the government's foreign policy for a particular region. Many other countries do this. I believe France has a written document that's updated every 5 years. I think the United Kingdom also has a written document for its foreign policy that's updated through a regular process. The U.S. government's position on various regions of the world is clear through their publication of documents. We now have a situation where it's not clear what exactly the policy is. The department's 13,000 people or so. If you want to coordinate the department and the whole of government, having a single guiding document, to me, seems to make a lot of sense.
Communication is key, and clearly communicating that the Indo-Pacific matters and that and what Canada's approach to the Indo-Pacific is critical. Whether that's the form of a fully updated document, of written notes that articulate how Canada's thinking is now different from the original strategy in 2022, I don't know. But I would agree that that communicating how Canada sees the region and that Canada sees the region as critical is important.
I mean, I personally think they should be updating the document, and I think that would be a good recommendation of this committee when it's completed its review of the strategy. But, if experts don't feel that's the case, then it's more difficult to make that recommendation. There's our witness online here, Mr. Vanash.
Yes,
have a view.
I can be very quick. So I think it would be very good to update the Indo-Pacific strategy to reflect the new reality that we're facing. Of course, it would have to be very general. Not all the details have to be presented, but indeed, as Minister Anand has already indicated, we are in a new reality. Therefore, the Indo-Pacific strategy should be changing. It's good to write that down.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you very much. We go next to Anita Vandelbeld. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do have a number of questions, but just on what my colleague, Mr. Chong, was saying, I did not hear the officials say that there would not be a written strategy. I think it was just premature to see what form that it was going to take. So I think we have to be careful not to put words in people's mouths. But I do want to address some of the things you said, Mr. Ostwald, because I was very interested when your comment about language and, teaching Indo-Pacific Asian languages here in Canada and the level of knowledge. And I just wonder, the obvious question then becomes, what about the role of diaspora communities? And I know a lot of the business that is happening, you have a large community, very diverse, with links to the whole region, with the language skills, with the knowledge. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that.
Thank you for the question. The diaspora plays a role in this, and of course the diaspora should be seen as an important resource for Canada. It strengthens people-to-people connections. It lays out networks. I see the diaspora as part of a solution and not as a primary solution. And I'll just answer that through an anecdote. I teach a class on Southeast Asian politics. A good portion of my class are Canadians with Southeast Asian heritage. Typically, they know one country well culturally. Maybe they have language skills for one country. Often they have not been to the region at all, or if they have, they've been to that one country. It's a large region. And so I think the diasporic connections, while they're important, they don't replace systematic training across the board.
Thank you very much, and I think that's duly noted. I also, this committee in 2018, when I was on the committee before, did travel to the region, and we chose to go to Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And we did find the same thing that you were saying at that time. There was a tremendous desire and willingness and openness to have more of Canada and to build those relationships. And I'd like to specifically ask about South Korea and Japan. Strategically, security-wise, there are a lot of shared perspectives there. And what you see some of the opportunities, and if we could save some time for Mr. Van Ash on the same question, that would be great. Go ahead.
Straight to Mr. Van Ash as
Okay,
well.
Mr. Van Ash, if you wanted to start.
Well, yes, there's a lot of opportunities of collaboration with Japan and Korea, and they're already starting to go on. So we have things to offer to Korea, and this is going back to the question of Monsieur Guibault. So it's not only critical minerals, but we also are very strong in artificial intelligence and in many other services sectors that we often forget about. Korea has been very good in developing a supply chain early warning system that allows to identify where potential choke points are. And I've written a piece with a Korean colleague on trying to think about how Canada and Korea would be able to collaborate in developing a more advanced supply chain early warning system. So this is just a very good example, and it also is the same thing with Japan. So when we think of clean energy technologies, we are always worried about the dominance of China, which is for very good reasons. But if you start looking at where we can diversify, the two countries that really jump up are Korea and Japan. So again, here there is a lot of interest for us to start looking at these countries, which are very natural allies in reflecting on a joint economic security strategy and also as a part of our trade diversification strategy.
We would be very interested, I think, as a committee to get a copy of that article that you wrote about the supply chain early warning system. Are there other examples like that in the region where there are things that could be shared across in terms of some of the strategies?
I mean, again, there's many examples of this. So as we're kind of thinking of engaging more with ASEAN, just to give an example, it's actually very natural to do this right now because China is getting expensive. So doing assembly in China is not something that a lot of companies are looking at. So automatically, we're already starting to look at Vietnam, maybe Malaysia and other countries. So ultimately, this focus on these other countries and strong points that these other countries have that we can actually develop complementarities with is really what we should be doing as we're trying to develop a richer Indo-Pacific strategy.
Thank you very much. Right on time. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before the committee and for your testimony. We really appreciate that. We will now briefly suspend in order to prepare for the next panel. Thank you. Dr. Stephen R. Nagy, Professor, China Policy Project Lead and Senior Fellow, International Christian University, Macdonald-Laurier Institute, by video conference, and Cleo Pascal, non-resident Senior Fellow, Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Unfortunately, Mr. Miller, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who was going to join us by video conference from Budapest, was not able to do so because he had technical issues with his headset. So we have two witnesses for the second panel.
He is from Budapest.
Yes, sorry. So I now invite Mr. Nagy to make an opening statement.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, because I skipped it. You're on mute, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be able to share some ideas with this committee on Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy going forward. And what I'd like to do is break down my ideas into 4 points, focusing on Canada's national interests in the Indo-Pacific, and 5 points in terms of what are some of our strategic approaches to be able to achieve these national interests. In terms of national interests, I break it down into 4. I think our Prime Minister said it very well. Maybe he quoted me in one of my earlier papers, but we need to be at the table, not on the menu, in terms of being on every single agreement within the region. And I say that with all, in good humor, but we need to be at the regulatory table for AI development, for technology, for energy security, for how we deal with sea lines of communication, for defense and regional security, disinformation, as well as economic security. Secondly, and I think really importantly, as we think about where Canada should be, we are clearly interested in preventing traditional security and non-traditional security issues from emerging. Traditional securities could be a Taiwan contingency, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction on the Korean Peninsula, or some kind of incident in the South China Sea. All of these have severe implications for Canada in terms of economy. And just noting the previous panel, when we talk about the Taiwan Strait, most estimates are between 10 and 15 trillion US dollars of damage to the global economy in the case of some kind of contingency. And I'll come back to that. In terms of non-traditional security issues, they're quite clear. Climate change, climate change, climate change. And if we think about the Pacific Islands, we think about the maritime environment in the South China Sea and how this could affect food security in Southeast Asia, this will have spillover effects in Canada. Third, I want to talk about preventing the emergence of a regional hegemon. And in this case, there's only one country that would like to be the regional hegemon, and that's China. And if China is the regional hegemon, this is going to affect Canada's access to trade agreements, it's going to affect Canada's access to sea lines of communication, and it's going to affect how regional agreements, whether they're trade, AI, technology, emerge. Lastly, and I think most importantly in the Canadian context, is we need to plan beyond political cycles. When I come to Canada, I see just this fixation on the United States. But in reality, in the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to see a change of power in Russia, China, India, as well as the United States. In Russia, we expect a more ultra-nationalist country. In China, when Xi Jinping steps down, or we don't know what happens to him, we will see a blank in leadership from China. This is what's happened in the past. We see China disappear for 3 or 4 years. What does this mean for our engagement within this region? What does it mean for those traditional and non-traditional security issues I mean? And what does it mean for, most importantly, Taiwan? And I want to reassert this. When we think about India, Prime Minister Modi has brought stability, but he's also brought Hindu nationalist behavior. We know that India has killed a Canadian of Sikh background in Canada. What happens if a more nationalist India emerges? And lastly, of course, is the United States. We don't know where the MAGA movement will and how will it mutate in the future, but we need to be thinking beyond the news cycles of today and what our southern neighbors' president will be saying. I can't emphasize this enough. This is Canada's national interest. In terms of our strategic approach, and this will be controversial, but I believe that we need to anchor our Indo-Pacific within the region by having the strongest relationship with the United States, and that means we are the indispensable partner for the United States. We are an asset economically, technologically, and strategically. And we need to continue to invest in the United States despite the difficulties. As I mentioned, Trump will be gone, MAGA will change, but the United States' geographic, institutional, and legal realities that connect Canada to the United States will remain. Secondly, we need to develop bilateral and minilateral relationships. Both of the previous witnesses did mention this, and I'm so glad they talked about Japan and South Korea as dependable partners. Singapore. But we need to develop new dependable partners, and they may not look like us politically, but I think Vietnam, Indonesia are important partners to invest in as we think about how to cultivate strong and enduring relationships in Southeast Asia that are not only trade partners, but share our interests in the region. And I know one of the committee members talks about values, and I appreciate the emphasis on values. But if we focus on values only, we're going to alienate key partners that I think are really important, such as Vietnam, even Indonesia, and frankly, India. So this is going to be something important. We also need to think about minilateral relationships. This echoes a little bit our Prime Minister's comments about middle power coalitions, although I think about this very differently. I think we need to have functional partnerships that are focused on problem solving. And our efforts in terms of illegal, unregulated, and undocumented fishing is a very good example of that. We need to leverage. Let me finish.
Yeah. Could you
Can I
conclude
finish
quickly?
one more point?
Yeah.
Thank you. Lastly, and I think importantly, we need to strengthen Canada at home. If we're not strong at home, we're not integrated at home, those interprovincial barriers are not broken down, we're not going to be a strong, competitive, and productive economy that can engage in the Indo-Pacific and be an attractive partner for Indo-Pacific partners to engage with Canada and the North American market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now invite Ms. Pascal to make her opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, membres du comité, merci.
Chair and members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm going to focus on areas that are easy to overlook, which is why I gave you a map. First, strategic geography. Indo-Pacific plans often take for granted a continuation of access. For example, U.S. planners assumed the ability to freely use the critical American base on Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean for Iran operations. However, not only did the UK initially deny the U.S. permission to use the base, the UK was also on the cusp of handing the Chagos Archipelago, including Diego, to Mauritius, a country with close ties to China. It's possible that, had the Iran war not happened, the strategic implications of the proposed UK-Mauritius deal would not have reached the Oval Office. U.S. defense posture in the Indian region would have seriously been undermined, and I'm not sure that we have planned for that. From a Canadian perspective, the situation is even more acute in the Pacific. If you've been to Japan or the Philippines, you know how long the flight is. Now imagine that by ship, which is how most of our trade travels. Since the end of World War II, the Central Pacific has been peaceful, and unfettered east-west travel between Asia and the Americas has been the foundation of a free, open, and increasingly prosperous Indo-Pacific, and that was not an accident. Imperial Japan controlled a section of the Central Pacific almost the size of the continental United States from 1914 until it was dislodged by American troops 30 years later in World War II. It took 100,000 American deaths fighting on islands like Peleliu and Saipan before Washington could work up the infrastructure to liberate the region. And after the war, it worked with islanders to set up unique structures to try to ensure the critical Central Pacific would stay free. The entire region was offered to become part of the United States. The Northern Mariana Islands voted in favor and became the newest part of the U.S. in 1976. The other islands divided into 3 new independent countries: Palau, Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia, or FSM. On the map, they're the countries in the middle here, east-west countries in the middle. That zone bridges the maritime space roughly between Hawaii, Philippines, and Guam. U.S. ties with these 3 countries are unlike anything the U.S. has with anyone else. They are beyond a doubt America's closest allies. Their citizens can live and work freely in the U.S., something Canadians cannot. They can serve in the U.S. military. They receive a wide range of U.S. federal government services, and the U.S. is responsible for the defense, because defending Palau, Marshall Islands, and the FSM means ensuring a hostile foreign power can't block the east-west flow between Asia and the mainland USA or Canada. This leads to a second point. We shouldn't be taking this for granted. Whenever anyone talks about China taking Taiwan, as we have several times today, operationally that means China at the very least neutering the U.S. in these islands and taking offline the U.S. territories of Guam and the Marianas. Beijing is currently actively trying to do that, and locals know it. One of the preferred tools is corruption. In 2023, the president of FSM, Daniel Penuelo, wrote, "We are bribed to be complicit and bribed to be silent." This is a sitting president wrote this. The practical impact of this is that some senior officials and elected officials take actions that are contrary to FSM's national interests but are consistent with the PRC's national interests. The intention, he wrote, was to pull FSM, quote, very close into Beijing's orbit, intrinsically tying the whole of our economies and societies to them, end quote. The U.S. has been countering this, but until recently, the U.S.'s definition of defense has been largely kinetic. For example, $2 billion in announced military infrastructure investments in FSM alone. But if Beijing pays off the right low-level environmental officers, let alone members of the FSM government itself, the implementation will get bogged down while Chinese companies move in, and the U.S. could be building infrastructure China will end up using. What does all this mean for Canada? Given our limited resources, I would suggest an element of the renewed strategy be to identify strategic geography that underpins a free and open Indo-Pacific, then work smart with the block and build approach. That means help block what the Philippines calls China's illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive operations that corrupt local societies, politics, and economics, while at the same time build real resilience. So, for example, for blocking, Palau would like access to Canada's dark fleet detection technology. It would help. For building, one example of effective people-to-people work is that of Métis innovator Bruce Hardy, who is leading Indigenous-led food and energy resilience work incorporating First Nations communities in Canada and the Pacific. The U.S. is starting to test this approach. Agreements signed with Palau in December will result in the U.S. sending investigators to help with corruption cases, foreign investment screening, and border security. That's blocking, while at the same time funding a new hospital, building. The just-announced 4,000-acre Pax Silica-related U.S. economic security zone in the Philippines is another example. The Indo-Pacific is off balance. We need to block and build in key locations to maintain balance. At this stage, sending investigators and lawyers to support partners fighting corruption can have a bigger real effect than sending a few extra delegates to yet another multilateral cocktail party. Merci.
Thank you very much for your statement. I will now open the floor for questions, beginning with MP Michael Chong. You have 6 minutes.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Madame Pascal a bit about her opening statement. Could you elaborate a bit further on the corruption that the PRC is promulgating throughout the Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands? And globally, yes.
Yeah,
but more specifically there, could you get into further detail about that?
Yes.
And then secondly, could you then make recommendations to this committee about the role that Canada could play, as you say, in providing lawyers and capacity building to fight that kind of corruption?
Yeah, sure. So China will often come into countries like this and present what looks like the sort of commercial support that they really need. So in the case of Palau, for example, we're going to help you build up your tourism sector. And then once they've got you, they then use that economic leverage to, in the case of Palau, literally crash the economy. They pulled out all the tourists at once because Palau is a country that recognizes Taiwan. So they said, unless you de-recognize Taiwan and recognize China, our tourists aren't coming back. But that was after they had built up the economic dependency. At the same time, there was major Chinese organized crime operating in Palau. This is a country of less than 20,000 people, and you had triad operators like Broken Tooth operating there. The reason was because as the money comes in, you've got this commercial face with a strategic component to it, but the third element of the braid is always corruption. There's always a corruption element, and it's sometimes put on steroids by Chinese organized crime. And that is a weak point for the Chinese. If you take away the corruption, their investments look a lot less attractive. And the obviousness of the strategic element is there. And we know this just very quickly, just to get on the record. The 2017 National Intelligence Law requires all Chinese individuals and organizations to support Chinese intelligence efforts, as you've said yourself. So this is the sort of thing that we need to incorporate into the assessment of any Chinese engagement in the region. What should we do? We should put in place an extremely strong domestic Canadian FARA regulations to begin with, and make sure that we aren't living in a glass house while we're throwing stones.
Well, the Foreign Influence Transparency Act is coming into is being implemented as we speak. But what specifically could Canada do in these islands to help people like the president you quoted in fighting corruption?
Yeah. So unfortunately, President Panuelo wasn't reelected, and that's another thing that happens is if you stand up against China in the region, you end up being targeted. So I would say that in the case of a country like Palau, a country like Marshall Islands, a country like Tuvalu, countries that already recognize Taiwan, you have security and law enforcement infrastructures that are highly targeted by China, and they really want to resist China. So investigators, specialists in money laundering, specialists in how to track illegal money flows, and then say stuff. The U.S. recently designated the president of the Senate of Palau for taking Chinese money and being corrupt.
In other words, helping them build the independence of their judicial system, helping train law enforcement to prosecute these kinds of crimes?
They don't actually need more workshops. Okay. They need people to come and do the work. And they're very much open to having people come and do the work. And I would also argue that this area is unlike any other area, this area that we're talking about. It would make sense to shift that area to Canada's embassy in Japan, because Japan has much closer ties to the region. They're tracking this more closely. And Canada can start working with the Taiwanese in countries that recognize Taiwan to help.
Which embassy currently has responsibility?
So they're mostly sitting in Canberra. Okay. Yeah, and it's not, they're just lumped in with the Pacific Islands. So, we set up an embassy in Fiji, but this is a whole different strategic environment.
I think I'm out of time. Am I No? Okay. Dr. Nagy, do you have any comments on this?
I think Ms. Pascal's comments really are spot on. We see corruption throughout the region, and it's an area that we've, as Canadians, we've actually worked in the context of South China Sea, helping bolster the Vietnamese legal thinking so that they can better defend their, how they position themselves vis-a-vis China in the South China Sea. And I think, again, how we provide some legal training to the islanders may provide some assistance in dealing with corruption, preventing corruption from emerging. So this is it's a soft contribution to the region, but I think it's a meaningful contribution that can help us deal with corruption and Chinese influence within the Pacific Islands.
Should that be the priority of our foreign aid policy in the region?
Ultimately, Canada has limited resources, Mr. Chong, and in that sense, I think that we may want to outsource some of these activities to countries that are closer to the Pacific Islands, primarily the Australians and New Zealanders. We could provide assistance, but I think as we think about the size of the Indo-Pacific, the priority partners that I think we need to develop, such as Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, we may need to pick and choose where we're investing resources. And again, we have huge financial problems back at home. We have to pick and choose and build, I think, momentum in terms of our Indo-Pacific policy. And while I think this is an important initiative, again, I'm in favor of choosing priority partners that are big enough to provide some momentum for Canada's permanent engagement in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Rob Oliphant. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 3 questions I'm going to try to address with the witnesses. The first has to do with North Pacific, particularly looking at Japan and South Korea as strategic partners. The second would be lessons learned from Australia and New Zealand. And the third one, I'm going to push a little bit more on the Pacific Islands as a place of real interest. So on the North Pacific, and Professor Nagy, you're in Japan, you've had a career there. Can you talk a little bit about where Japan is vis-a-vis Canada? We've had recent high-level visits. We have a new government in Japan, relatively new government in Japan, and what you see the Canada-Japanese bilateral relationship evolving over the next few years.
Thank you very much. I think this is a super question. I look at Japan as really the canary in the coal mine in terms of how to deal with the challenges within the region, in particular China, how to manage the engagement, but also building resilience into the relationship and deterrence. But at the same time, they have the most nuanced policies towards Southeast Asia. in the context of how Canada engages with Japan, I think there's some real opportunity to learn from Japan, build some synergies in our policies of how we engage with Southeast Asian countries bilaterally, but also through ASEAN. Southeast Asia, really, a country-by-country approach is important, but we have to recognize that ASEAN moves as a whole. And if we want to have credibility, we have to recognize ASEAN's centrality within the region. Japan has done this exceptionally well, and they do it through soft means, building infrastructure, connectivity, business investments, trade agreements. And again, I think it's a really good platform for how we're engaging within the region. And as met with China, it's not a zero-sum relationship with China. They engage. They have a $300 billion trade agreement every year. It's by and large equal. They have huge difficulties as well, but they're wise enough to be able to try and balance. So I think we can learn from how Japan's managing. Where do we head in the next 4 or 5 years? I see stability in the Japanese political system. I see that they are willing to invest in defense, willing to invest in resilience, willing to invest in partners that want to build strong ties. I think energy security, critical mineral security are going to be huge places for Canada and Japan to build synergies. Our government has already been doing this, but I think there's a lot more that we can do in terms of Japan and Canada. Mr. Oliphant, I think that it's
I want to push a little bit on South Korea.
Can I just finish?
A little bit on South Korea as well.
Sure.
Because only Canada and South Korea have really identified the North Pacific as an area. And what does that signify in terms of a regional approach?
Great. I'm glad you said South Korea, because I think that as we think about energy security and we think about critical minerals, it's not just Japan that's going to be our partner. I wanted to just say that we should work with South Korea as well. On the North Pacific side, I think that this nomenclature actually is not recognized outside the region. When I first read it in the Indo-Pacific strategy, actually I wasn't sure what it meant. And I work with many people in GAC and defense, and I understand they want to link the Arctic. But it's not a terminology that I think has currency within the region. And if we want to get more currency, we want to get more Canadian contributions in the region, and for us to be able to be seen seriously, I think we need to speak the currency of the region. And that means talking about Northeast Asia rather than the North Pacific. Still, South Korea shares many national interests with Canada, importantly, values with Canada, and it's a clear partner for helping us engage with China, engage in Southeast Asia and the broader region.
Talking about Australia and New Zealand for a moment, my concern about going to South Pacific Islands, if you take Papua New Guinea out of it, which is 10 million people, and then you take Fiji out, you're left with a number of countries with 20,000 people and 25,000 people. I'm just trying to say, how does that possibly relate to our work in South Korea, Japan, China, even Indonesia, Malaysia? So I'm just wondering if Ms. Pascal can talk about where that's coming from, because it simply is so. And we have Commonwealth ties already, and so you're saying cutting Canberra out, where we are related to them through the Commonwealth quite profoundly. So our Commonwealth instincts should be there. We're not Americans, we're Canadians, and so the Commonwealth is important.
I'm not saying of course the Commonwealth is important, but these countries, you meet people where they are. Would you interact with Vietnam through Canberra? These countries are not part of the rest of the Pacific. But just on the point of Australia and the bang for the buck that you get in the Pacific, if you engage with Japan, you are maybe, at best, we could be, 8 or 9 of Japan's most important trading partners. If you're in the Pacific, which costs a lot less and which is highly strategically important, you can be the point person for other people who want to come in and understand the Pacific, including the EU. And there are areas, for example, that speak French, like New Caledonia, French Polynesia, where Canada's bilingual profile could be particularly value-added. And New Caledonia is having a lot of problems. They have 20% of the world's nickel. I would not go by population when you're looking at how important these locations are. 100,000 Americans died during World War II because of the strategic importance of the locations. We're looking at deep-sea mining, if you're looking just at resources, for example. You've got situations like, again, back into la Nouvelle-Calédonie, qui est tellement important pour la stabilité.
New Caledonia.
With all due respect to my Australian friends, they have messed up so badly that we now have to look at the situation. The corruption from Pacific Island leaders, in many cases, especially the South Pacific, gets laundered through Australian banks and real estates, and they never do what the U.S. just did in terms of designating illegal partners.
Thank you very much. We go next to Monsieur Duceppe. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Mr. Duceppe, you have 6 minutes. That was a remarkable answer, Ms. Pascal, for a question that for which such an answer might not have been expected. Congratulations, Ms. Pascal. Perhaps we haven't yet spoken about the Solomon Islands. Perhaps it's important to mention them because there was an intervention of China in that territory. It is also strategic. Perhaps you could give us a picture of what's happening in the Solomon Islands for the committee. Have you met Mr. Daniel Sudani? Yes. The case of Daniel Sudani is very sad.
He was the premier of Malaita province, and when Solomon Islands switched from Taiwan to China, the other thing about the Pacific Islands is if you understand how China operates in the Pacific Islands, it's like a mini version of how they operate globally. So it really helps you understand the mechanisms that China uses. And in 2019, they switched from Taiwan to China, and he stood up for his people and said, my province, we don't want Chinese companies operating. And they targeted him. And he came to the U.S. to try to gain an understanding, and he came here, and he met with members, with yourself. I don't know if you know what happened to him. Yeah, so they hounded him through lawfare. He became very ill. This was this last summer. And he went into, he had kidney failure, and he went into the hospital in Honiara. And the only dialysis machine in that hospital was donated by China. And the person who decided who would get medical care was a Chinese person who answered to the embassy. And he did not get medical care, and he died. And we're starting to increasingly see across the Pacific Islands the use of medical care by China as an exporting of the social credit system to exert leverage on locals. Alors, je vous remercie énormément d'avoir.
Thank you very much for having mentioned Mr. Daniel Sudani and the struggle that he led, and I hope it will continue. You talked about the diplomatic space that Canada ought to have in the Indo-Pacific region. There are rumors, there's nothing confirmed. There are rumors that we hear behind the scenes because of cutbacks now in various departments, including global affairs, that there might be places which would be closed down in the world diplomatic scene by Canada. There are two places which often are mentioned. There's Auckland in New Zealand, and there's also Osaka in Japan for the consulate. Wouldn't that be, as regards the Indo-Pacific strategy, wouldn't that be a considerable loss if we were to close those two locations? And if so, why? Okay, well, I'm never in favor of closing something down, but the one in Auckland, well, I don't know. In the case of the Five Eyes, what they do really in Auckland. If it's not a strategic zone, as regarding intelligence protection, then it's not as important as Osaka.
In the Central and North Pacific. And I would just say the other thing about Solomon Islands is this is the site of the Battle of Guadalcanal, and the Chinese are currently rebuilding, they're involved in putting in infrastructure at Henderson Field, where a lot of Americans died, and others. They have studied World War II map, and they're replicating it.
Monsieur Nag, il me reste du temps, Monsieur.
Do I have any time left, Chair? Yes. Now you talked about relations with the U.S., and you said that in 3, 4, 5 years there would be changes among the heads of various organizations. I agree 100% with you. I trust in democratic institutions, whether legal or judiciary in the U.S. What we have to understand is that the Chinese Communist Party will probably still be there 50 years down the road. Wouldn't that be pretty major issue when we talk about getting closer to China diplomatically and commercially compared to our relations with the U.S.? Shouldn't we integrate the U.S. in our Indo-Pacific strategy?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Except for the question, I think it's really important. You're right, the Communist Party will be around for the next 20, 30 years, and we need to ensure that we are creating a broader strategy that has that in mind. But the United States We've seen oscillations in the United States power. It does become unpredictable, but at the same time, we have a geographic, institutional, legal, and let's not forget the millions of families that have connections within the United States. I continue to advocate for building an indispensable relationship with the United States, concrete measures as dealing with foreign interference seriously, dealing with Arctic security seriously. But also I think it's important for us to continue to have a strategic vision of how we're going to engage with the Indo-Pacific, with the United States as a key partner, but that doesn't mean we have the same policy as the United States. We are Canadians. We engage with Canada, with the region through Canadian interests, but we will never be able to have an effective policy with the Indo-Pacific without having the strongest and deepest relationships with the United States. We should remember that Indo-Pacific countries, whether it's South Korea or Japan, or Southeast Asian countries, look to Canada and they understand that we are so close to the market in North America and the United States. We share many institutions, laws. We share respect for rule of law. We have strong cross-state partnerships. And that, despite the challenges in the relationship today, will continue 3 or 4 years from now. And I think that we need to continue to invest. And it's not just in Washington. Canadian leaders need to visit all 50 states to build the strongest of partnerships that advocate for Canada's interests. And I think some of the leaders are doing this, but we need to do much more because the United States is not going away, and either is our geographic relationship. Thank you very much, Mr. Duceppe, for a great question.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Kramp-Naiman. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Madame Pascal and Professor Nagy, for your expertise and perspective today. I'll start with the first question with regards to how the government has painted the Indo-Pacific Strategy update as more of an evolution instead of a new document. Given the government's shifting position on China and given the immense weight that the nation plays in the Indo-Pacific, first question for Madame Pascal is there any concern that this signals a fundamental change in the approach to the region?
Do you remember the old TV show, the old ad about, Miss Cleo knows the, this one, I don't know. I can't, all I can do is go by actions, and I suspect that one of the reasons maybe they're not, the Indo-Pacific strategy when it came out was pretty good, and it got a lot of positive attention across the region, and I suspect anything new would be somewhat watered down and would invite criticism from a lot of different sides. So why do it, I guess, if you're the government? But that's as good as I can get. I'm sorry.
That's fair. So earlier this year, I had the privilege of visiting Taiwan with a Canadian delegation and speaking with leadership there. And since they're extremely concerned about how Taiwan fits into the revamped Indo-Pacific strategy from a government that has made it clear that they're seeking closer economic ties with China. So my first question is, what messaging does this send to our allies in the region? And further, what message does it send when 2 government MPs were sent home from Taiwan when we were there?
So that's not good. But I wouldn't overestimate how much people are looking at us. So in preparation for this hearing, I asked friends across the region, Americans, Indians, all, what they thought about Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. And my American colleague, who was in charge of planning for the Indo-Pacific at Camp Smith in Hawaii, said that's like a Trivial Pursuit question. So I think that our profile is not that high, which is why identifying niche areas like the dark vessel technology is great, or specific countries like Pacific Islands or the Francophonie push, identifying places where we can stand out would make people care more.
So do you believe that we run the risk, or the Canadian government runs the risk of signaling to our Indo-Pacific allies that we're ceding soft power to Beijing? And further, are there domestic economic security concerns with stronger trade ties made to China?
Yes, and also, the language around the U.S., that's generally not like. You've got countries like the Philippines that are putting their neck on the line with radical transparency and things like that. And to hear Canada sort of harping at this new piece of strategic economic infrastructure that the U.S. is putting into the Philippines, that is going to be basically sovereign U.S. territory within the Philippines to set up on the Pax Silica stuff and the ice stuff. Canada should be a part of that. But the way that we're talking about our neighbor, which obviously have the right to do, that does not necessarily get heard the way we think it gets heard by the frontline states.
And within the strategy itself, it recognizes China as an increasingly disruptive power. Do you agree with that analysis? And actually, I'm curious, has your organization or you as an individual been consulted in the revamping of the strategy?
I have not, well, except for you guys, thank you. But how can I put this? I think that the way that the revamp should be done is how you're doing it, and also just to quickly jump to a side topic about the U.S. There's going to be a new census in 2030, and that's going to affect apportionment of seatings. So states, sorry, I'm too Canadian, like Florida and Texas are going to get a lot more seats. So as you're putting together conceptualizations of how things are going forward, understanding how the census will affect politics in the U.S. in 2030, because the strategy has a long-term time frame, I think would be helpful. Sorry.
And last question to Professor Nagy. You acknowledged in your opening remarks within 5 to 6 years we'll potentially have leadership changes in Russia and China and the U.S. And despite the current challenges that we're currently enduring, you also acknowledged the strong at home. Could you elaborate a little bit further on, indeed, we have the geographic connection to the U.S., but in order for us to establish and continue with the long-term security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific, how do you see that playing out? If you could elaborate a little bit more.
A very brief response, please.
Thank you very much. So I believe in us leveraging our comparative advantages in terms of geographic proximity, our access to the United States market, our institutional overlap to be able to be a window for Indo-Pacific countries to enter through Canada, invest in Canada, and invest in the United States. And I think that we need to continue to be that bridge that benefits United States, benefits the Indo-Pacific countries, but most importantly, benefits Canada and Canada's prosperity.
I go next to MP Steven Guilbeault, who I understand is sharing his time with MP O'Rourke for 5 minutes.
As I don't have much time, I'd like to speak to the witnesses about climate change. You both talked about that. The strategy mentioned it is an important issue in that region of the world. And of course, because of the impact of climate change, and at the end of the cycle of our 5-year investment cycle with the Paris Agreement on climate change, we financed capacity development, strengthening of capacity partnership between Canadian universities and research centers in that region. So we're preparing to renew our next period of 5 years of engagement on climate. And Professor Nagy and yourself, Ms. Pascal, what would be your recommendations to the Canadian government on that issue? Thank you.
Maybe I'll speak. Thank you very much, Mr. Guilbeault. Again, climate change is going to affect different parts of the Indo-Pacific differently. If we look at the South China Sea area, the Mekong Delta will probably be salinized. This will affect the food security of of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And it's hard to imagine this doesn't cascade into a refugee crisis or instability. So I think that when we think about Canada's investment in a place like the South China Sea and dealing with climate change, of course, there's a global approach, but we ultimately have to work with those partners on the ground to try and deal with the challenges that they're facing domestically. So this is not necessarily a big expenditure. It could be something as simple as education. It could be as simple as NGOs helping the local communities deal with local environmental problems. So I think there's many different levels. And then if we go to the Pacific Islands, these countries may not be around in 20 or 30 years, and this will affect, of course, it'll affect these people, but it'll affect how the United Nations work. These countries will disappear. How will they be affected? How will they be susceptible to corruption? As Ms. Pascal mentioned, their lives are on the line and this will make them susceptible. So as we think about climate change, I don't think it's so simple to think about it in terms of, dealing with carbon, but thinking about how we can change what's happening on the ground in these communities to prevent climate change from really, really damaging these countries, perhaps making them disappear. So I think that there's a lot of things that Canada can do, but ultimately I think that if we are damaging our economy for the cost of climate change, I think that this is probably an ill-considered strategy. We need to take the right balance, and everything is the right balance. How can we be prosperous, but how can we also deal with climate change in the short, mid, and long term? Thank you for the really thoughtful question.
Madam O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
It's up to you. You're sharing your time, but I figured. Okay.
Dr. Nagy, just a quick question. Canada is signing an increasing number of trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, including Indonesia, which is the world's fourth largest economy, Clean Energy Partnership, and an MOU on AI safety with Australia, to name just a few. And so our Prime Minister has
sorry, I can't hear Ms. O'Rourke. Can you? Is there a volume issue on my side or your side?
The mic's on, yeah. Can you hear me now? No. Yes, Dr. Nagy, can you hear me?
2 minutes.
That's very strange. Okay, how about now, Dr. Nagy? So just in the interest of time, why don't we let Ms. Pascal answer Mr. Kabu's question?
Here.
Yeah.
He just said something. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear now. Yes, I can.
Okay.
My apologies.
All right. Thank you. So as you know, our Prime Minister has been very aggressively signing trade deals globally, including a comprehensive economic partnership with Indonesia, Clean Energy Partnership, and an MOU on AI safety with Australia. I'm wondering, with all these trade and defense partnerships in the region, are these actions in line with the substance you were calling for during your appearance before the Canada-China Relations Committee in 2022?
Are you speaking to me or Ms. Pascal?
I was speaking with you, Dr. Nagy.
Thank you very much for the question. So as I think about how our new Prime Minister he's not so new anymore, but as engaging in the Indo-Pacific, I can't help not to think that he brings dignity, thoughtfulness, and technocratic skill to the position of the Prime Ministership. But at the same time, as I think we think about our diversifying our trade towards India, towards Indonesia, and building these trade partners or clean air partnerships with Australia, I think, are these the best uses of our comparative advantages to be able to tackle the real challenges in the region? And the real challenge from my standpoint is, again, China's pursuit of what we call hegemony in the region, dominating the region and reshaping the region. And if it reshapes the region along rules that preference China, this will obviously negatively affect Canadian interests. So as I watch the Prime Minister, I think that, again, the engagement with China needs to be thoughtful. As he says, the guardrails need to be high. But I think we need to be very realistic about China's willingness to use force against Taiwan, which will have a fundamental disruption to the global economy. Its interest in dominating what we call the Indo-Pacific, and this will fundamentally affect trade agreements, will affect AI regulation, will affect how we use sea lanes of communication. In this case, I think that the priorities of the Prime Minister should be focused on understanding these issues and building relationships, trade agreements, energy agreements, critical mineral agreements, and security agreements and disinformation agreements that actually tackle those issues, which I think are the priority for Canada and Canadian interests.
Thank you very much. We go next to Monsieur Duceppe. You have 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci. Monsieur Nagy, c'était...
Thank you. Mr. Nagy asked this question to the previous panel, but I'd like to hear you on it. Everybody talks about a possible military offensive by China, especially after we've seen what has been done by the Defense National Committee of China with Xi Jinping cleaning out the Central Defense Committee. And there are clear issues if Beijing gets its hands on 90% of the best semiconductors production in the world, that means that AI control and the fact that we won't have access to those products. When should it become a central focus in our Indo-Pacific strategy to have that in mind, and to what extent the defense of Taiwan and its democratic environment is important for what remains to be done by Canada and Quebec?
Merci pour notre bonne question.
Thank you for a good question. That's very good.
Question. I think about Taiwan, I want to put it in the perspective that we can understand very clearly. A conflict across the Taiwan Straits would be between 10 and 15 trillion US dollars in damage to the global economy. It would devastate the production networks in China. It would dramatically negatively affect Southeast Asia and India. Southeast Asia and India's biggest FDI providers are Taiwan, China, and Japan, the economies that would be devastated. This is not to mention, as you mentioned, the damage to semiconductor supply chains, but also control of the First Island chain, which would basically allow China to put submarines along the trench, keeping the United States out, Canada out, and any other countries out of the Indo-Pacific region to ensure that those sea lanes are open for trade, but also energy. This is a priority, but I think as Canada thinks about the Taiwan issue, I think that we should continue to invest in Taiwan as an international public good. Avoid the one China question. What happens to Taiwan matters to Canada, it matters to Germany, it matters to Palau, it matters to every single country on the planet. And we need to invest our diplomatic resources from that perspective and build alliances and partnerships that have a similar thinking about Taiwan as an international public good. We also wanted to have peace and stability, and we want to make sure that whatever happens to Taiwan is decided by Taiwanese people. Again, I want to reiterate this. Avoid talking about Taiwan through how China talks about Taiwan. Let's talk about Taiwan on our terms, and I think the terms that we should be using is Taiwan as an international public good, and we should invest our resources there, just like we invest them in the Great Barrier Reef, or we invest them in other international public goods. Again, thank you very much for the question.
Merci aux témoins.
Thank you very much. Madam Pascal, would you like to conclude any concluding remarks? Because we skipped over you twice, and I feel like
just quickly about the role of, because there's a lot of talk about multilateral organizations and things like that, and just to be aware of how successfully China has gamed multilateral organizations, including the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, things like that. So when you're talking about infrastructure projects in places like the Pacific Islands, you'll often see China winning the bid. But it's effectively subsidizing the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, which I like to think of as the Bribery and Repression Initiative, because that's functionally what's being spread out along the BRI. So before you go jumping full into the multilateral organizations, it's useful to do a risk analysis of exactly how much this has been gamed by China to make sure that Canada isn't actually funding Chinese operations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks, and thank you to both witnesses for your statements and presence and testimony. Colleagues, our next meeting will be this Thursday with the appearance of the Canadian Ambassador to the United States, Mr. Mark Wiseman. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Juste une petite question.
Just a brief question. Thank you to the witnesses. It was great. Chair, is Mr. Wiseman going to be here in person or by video conference?
Ici en personne.
Thank you very much. The will of the committee to adjourn the meeting. So adjourn.
Thank you. Merci.